Picture two people. One of them wakes up at 5 a.m. every single day. They work a demanding job, sometimes 60 hours a week. They rarely take vacations. They are exhausted by Friday, and they have been exhausted for years. The other person works a normal 9 to 5, 40 hours a week. They take their lunch breaks, they go home at 5, and they don't think about work again until the next morning. Here's the question that should bother you 20 years later. The second person, the one who worked less, has more money, more freedom, and more options than the first. How is that possible? If hard work was really the thing that determined wealth, the exhausted person should be the wealthy one. But in real life, that's not what usually happens. Some of the hardest working people you know are also some of the most financially stuck. And some of the wealthiest people you know don't appear to be working themselves to death at all. So if it isn't about effort, what is it actually about? That question is what this documentary is going to answer. And by the end, you may never think about money the same way again. Let's talk about two brothers. We'll call them Daniel and Marcus. Daniel and Marcus grew up in the same house with the same parents, the same financial struggles, and the same lessons about money, which in their case was mostly silence. Money was never discussed. It was a source of stress, not a subject for conversation. Daniel grew up to become incredibly hardworking. He took a stable job at a manufacturing company right out of high school. He worked overtime whenever it was offered. He never missed a shift. For 30 years, he showed up, did his job well, and brought home a paycheck. Marcus took a different path. He also worked a regular job, nothing glamorous, but early on he started doing something Daniel never did. He read about how money works, not get-rich-quick content, just basic information, how interest works, how debt works, how ownership works. By the time both brothers reached their 50s, Daniel was still living paycheck to paycheck, anxious about retirement, carrying debt he couldn't quite shake. Marcus, working a similar job with a similar income, had no debt, owned a small rental property, and had investments quietly growing in the background. Same family, same starting point, same work ethic in terms of effort and dedication. Completely different financial outcomes. What happened here wasn't about intelligence, luck, or even income. Something else was at play, something most people never get taught, and almost nobody talks about. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of us were never actually taught how money works. We're taught how to get a job. We're taught how to follow instructions, show up on time, and trade our hours for a paycheck. That's an incredibly useful skill, but it's only half of the equation. The other half, how money grows, how debt quietly drains wealth, how ownership creates freedom, is rarely taught in school, and often isn't modeled at home either, especially if the previous generation didn't understand it themselves. So people grow up financially capable of earning, but financially blind to everything that happens after the paycheck arrives, and this creates a strange trap. The harder you work, the more money flows through your hands, but if you don't understand what to do with it, that money flows right back out. More income often just means more spending, more upgrades, more "I deserve this." The income increases, but the gap between income and expenses stays exactly the same, or sometimes even shrinks. This is sometimes called the hedonic treadmill. You run faster, but you stay in the same place. Meanwhile, someone with a smaller income who understands even the basics of how money works can end up further ahead, simply because they aren't leaking money out the back door while they're busy earning it through the front. Working hard fills the bucket, but if there's a hole in the bottom, It doesn't matter how much water you pour in. So why don't people just learn this stuff? It's not exactly a secret that compound interest exists. The answer has less to do with information and more to do with psychology, specifically 3 things: identity, comfort, and time perception. First, identity. From a young age, many people absorb a quiet belief. Money isn't really for people like me. Maybe it came from watching parents stress about bills. Maybe it came from hearing that wanting more money is greedy, or that rich people are somehow different, smarter, luckier, or less honest. Whatever the source, this belief becomes part of someone's identity, and people are remarkably good at making their behavior match their identity, even when it works against them. Second, comfort. The human brain is wired to prioritize immediate comfort over long-term benefit. This is why saving money feels hard, but spending money feels good, instantly. A purchase gives you a small hit of relief or pleasure right now. Saving gives you nothing you can feel today. The reward is so far in the future that the brain barely registers it as real. Third, time perception. Most people dramatically underestimate how much time they actually have. 30 years sounds like forever, so the urgency to start isn't there. But 30 years from now arrives faster than anyone expects, and by the time it does, the window to use that time is gone. Put these 3 together: a belief that money isn't really for you, a brain that prefers comfort now over comfort later, and a sense that there's always more time. And you get a population of hard-working people who never quite get ahead, not because they're lazy, but because nothing in their environment ever interrupted that pattern. This pattern doesn't just affect bank accounts, it affects entire lives. Think about what financial stress actually does to a person. Ongoing money worries affect sleep, relationships, and even decision-making ability. When someone is constantly worried about whether they can cover next month's expenses, their brain is operating in a kind of survival mode, and survival mode is not a great place to make long-term decisions from. This creates a cycle. Financial stress makes it harder to think clearly about money. Thinking unclearly about money leads to decisions that create more financial stress. Round and round it goes. On a larger scale, this is part of why wealth gaps tend to widen over generations rather than shrink. It's not usually because one family is dramatically more talented or more hardworking than another. It's because one family's financial habits, even small ones, compound quietly over decades, while the other family's habits compound in the opposite direction. Multiply that across millions of households, and you start to see patterns play out across entire communities and even countries. Whole groups of people can be incredibly hardworking, incredibly resilient, and still find themselves financially stuck, not because of a lack of effort, but because of a lack of exposure to a different way of thinking about money. Here's the part that might be hardest to hear. The financial system as it exists today doesn't actually reward effort directly. It rewards ownership and leverage. When Daniel worked overtime, he traded hours for dollars, a direct, one-to-one exchange. When that hour was over, the income from it was over too. There was no version of that hour that kept paying him after the fact. When Marcus bought that small rental property, he wasn't trading his hours anymore. The property worked for him, generating income whether he was actively working that day or not. His money, instead of just sitting there or being spent, became a small employee of its own. This is the quiet difference between working for money and having money work for you. It's not about working less. Marcus still had a job. It's about what happens to the money after it's earned, And here's the truly hidden part. This isn't some secret reserved for the wealthy. The tools, savings accounts that earn interest, index funds, basic investing are available to almost anyone with even a small amount of consistent income. The information exists. The access exists. What's missing for most people isn't opportunity. It's awareness and the small, boring, consistent habits that turn awareness into results. So, what can actually be done with this information? First, separate earning from keeping. Earning more money is good, but it solves nothing on its own if spending rises to match it. The real shift happens when someone decides in advance that a portion of every dollar earned is not available to be spent, no matter how tempting it is. Second, understand that small amounts repeated consistently beat large amounts done occasionally. A modest sum set aside every single month left to grow over many years can outperform sporadic large efforts that stop and start. Third, learn just enough to make informed decisions, not to become an expert, but to stop being financially illiterate. Understanding the basics of how interest, debt, and investing work is often the difference between money working against you and money working for you. Fourth, question inherited beliefs about money. If a belief like money is hard to get, or people like me don't get ahead, has been quietly running in the background, it's worth asking. Where did that belief come from? And is it actually true? Or is it just familiar? None of this requires a high income. It requires a shift in direction, even a small one, sustained over a long enough period of time. Daniel and Marcus started in the exact same place, same family, same income level, same work ethic. But 30 years later, their lives looked completely different. Not because one of them worked harder, but because one of them understood something the other never had the chance to learn. That's the real story behind why most people stay poor, even while working hard. It's rarely about laziness, it's about a gap in understanding, one that's quietly passed down generation after generation until someone decides to interrupt it. The good news is that this gap can be closed, not overnight and not without effort, but it doesn't require a fortune or a special opportunity. It requires information, a shift in habits, and time. The clock is already running, whether you're using it or not. The only real question is, what will you do with the time you have left?